You heard from Sue about our wonderful guest, but let me say, we gather tonight at a moment, and I don't think I need to tell anyone in this audience who watches even a nanosecond of cable TV, or picks up the newspapers, at a moment when US-Russian relations are at their lowest and most dangerous point in the last 40 years, if not ever. So I think this conversation tonight is extraordinarily important, and as Sue said, it is to mark Steve's new book, War with Russia, which you may not agree with much of, but it is a dissenting, heretical, accessible, alternative narrative to what so many have been reading these last 4 or 5 years, from Putin and Ukraine to Trump and Russiagate. So I will say, the other day, we will talk a little bit about the media. The other day, we had the BuzzFeed story, which has been retracted for now, or hasn't been, but that President Trump directed Michael Cohen to lie to Congress. Every day, there are news allegations, there are Russiagate allegations. We have with us one of the great news anchors of our time who just, I think 2 weeks ago, wasn't it, Dan, who spoke toughly about the media and how it's abetted Trump. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to say, I want to be clear at the outset that while the book, War with Russia, is a collection of Steve's writings over the last 4 or 5 years for thenation.com, we don't agree on everything. And if our daughter, who sat at many dinner table conversations and heard us vigorously disagree, she's moved to California. If you want to hear disagreement, visit our dinner table. And our marriage has been the incubator of a great daughter, but it has not been the incubator of agreement on much. But I want to thank Dan Rather for being with us tonight. Steve was a consultant to CBS for at least a decade, I think. More. And we were just talking in the green room. But Dan may not know this, how he figures in our personal life, which intersects with Russia on so many levels. But the day after Steve and I got married, Steve spent his honeymoon with Dan Rather at the United Nations because Gorbachev was giving his great speech. In 1989, on the first anniversary of our wedding, we traveled with Dan and CBS to Rome and then to Malta, where Bush and Gorbachev announced the end of the Cold War. So very grateful to have Dan with us. Don't need to say, Sue described someone who has covered more than half a century of presidential elections, wars, turmoil, the political landscape of America in its fullness. So grateful to have Dan here tonight, but I'm going to turn to Steve first and ask you, and ideally in about 90 seconds, to summarize the most salient, controversial, important takeaways of your book.
You all saw that, right? The way she distanced herself from me, which has been a problem for 4 or 5 years. You should read the tribute, I think it's a tribute to Katrina, that I wrote in the book, which was basically, thank you for publishing these even though you didn't agree with many of them. And she took a lot of grief for quite a few. This is special for me tonight to be invited here. I'm grateful to the 92nd Street Y. These days I don't get invited many places, so I'm sort of grateful to be anywhere. I'm grateful that my wife, who's much more illustrious than I am, has put aside our disagreements briefly. But above all, to Dan Rather, we go way, way back. From when CBS did hire me to be a consultant on Russia in the 80s, late 80s, when Russia was becoming the front page news story. And we did travel a lot, and there's a lot of good stories to tell. But what I took away about Dan is very, very important. Dan, in public, persisted in referring to me as Professor Cohen, always. It was Professor Cohen. In private, it was Steve. I didn't know how to call him. Was I supposed to say Anchorman Dan Rather? I mean, what was the exact title? But the takeaway was this, that in my life, I have never met an exemplar, a model of civil discourse such as Dan Rather. And that's what I learned from him. Now, I didn't practice the trade very well, it's possible, but in all the stressful situations I saw Dan reporting from, his civility was just something I could not emulate. So civil discourse is something we lack in this country today, and I'm glad that Dan is back on television and setting an example, particularly for the younger people. So briefly, what's in the book? Well, probably too much in this sense, that I got mugged in 2014. I declared myself old, or to be politically correct, a senior citizen, decided to turn to an archived book I'd been working on for 20 years, and then Ukraine happened. And I couldn't resist. And I began appearing on a radio broadcast weekly and then writing up these as commentaries. And for the last 4 or 5 years, almost weekly, I've been caught up in unfolding events. What I rediscovered is how closely linked Russia and America are, not just in their relations, but each country tends to see itself refracted through the other country. This has gone on for centuries, by the way, but today it's really intense. I mean, if you want to hear a discussion about Russiagate, go to Moscow. I just wrote a post for The Nation today about that, how Russians are reacting to Russiagate. But what's in the book? Well, mainly this. The overlying argument is that we are in a new Cold War. People resisted that when I first began arguing it 15 years ago, but now it's more or less accepted. But my second argument, and this is not accepted, is that this Cold War is much more dangerous than the ones that I can't see the demographics of the audience, but I would judge, it's fair to say, the Cold War that most of us survived, this one is more dangerous. I see unfolding, and have protested this, a kind of repetition of neo-McCarthyism, not as bad as it was, but too much slurring of people who don't agree with one another. This is a bad thing because it delegitimizes a debate we need to have. That's another theme of the book. Unlike the previous Cold War, and Dan, we remember it vividly, 70s and 80s were full of debate in all the mainstream venues about the nature of the Cold War, who was responsible, what to do about it. There's almost none of that in America today. Then in the book, there is something that I stumbled upon, but I came convinced of, and that is the role, shadowy role, played by our intelligence services. Primarily the CIA when John Brennan was the head of it, but also the FBI, in the origins of what we now call Russiagate. So I have argued in the book that Russiagate is substantially Intelgate, something that involves the intelligence services. Then, and kind of an ongoing lament that I feel because I've been part of the media for decades. I worked for CBS, I wrote a column for The Nation magazine, but I think the media is not doing its job today in covering Russian-American relations. It always faltered sometimes, but this is the worst, I would call it media malpractice I have ever seen. And I mean the mainstream. I mean, there are many exceptions, but I'm talking about those outlets on which most of us depend. And finally, and this will be, if you all, again, I can't see the ages, but those of you all who are a certain age will remember that during the last Cold War, there was a very well mainstream organized opposition to the Cold War in the United States. It included heads of some of the major American corporations. It included aides to presidents. It included members of Congress. It included people who ran for president, that they were opposed to the Cold War, and they debated what could be done about it. There is no public debate in the mainstream today. It's one hand clapping. And that, to me, in my lifetime, is a radical change, and it's a concern that runs through this little book, and it's one reason that I changed the title. I had a different title in mind and called it War with Russia, ? Because in my long career of being involved in Russian-American relations as a scholar and a participant, I think our relations with Russia today are more dangerous than they have ever been, even including the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which we would all agree was the closest we came to nuclear war. So I am very, very worried. And if you don't want to be worried, you probably shouldn't read the book. But if you want to worry a little about things that are not being brought to your attention on a regular basis, then you might have a look.
If I may continue to follow along.
Please.
First of all, a very short preface, and it will be short. I'm here because anytime I'm around a professor, I learn a lot. I don't always agree with him. I don't agree with everything in this book. There are other things in the book in which I can't say I disagree, but I'm skeptical about. But for those of you who don't know, just let me underscore that, I come from Texas where football is kind of a secular religion. And the saying among coaches is, you are what your record is. And Steve is what his record is, and his record is that for the better part of half a century, he has, and I wouldn't say by consensus, but widely acknowledged to be one of, if not the premier experts on the old Soviet Union, Russia, and Russian history in all of what we roughly call Western civilization. So the first reason I'm here, out of respect for my friend, and he is my friend Steve, but that I always learn something. The other is, and I know the 92nd Y crowd pretty well, and you will appreciate our candor. We're here to sell a book. And that I want to help sell the book, because I do think that with Steve, who has some very controversial statements in the book, he's referred to a couple.
Yeah.
One that he considers what he calls Intel Gate to be much more important and dangerous than what he sees as the facts of Russiagate, an extremely serious charge. And if it were not coming from a Steve Cohen with his background, one might dismiss it. But with Steve's background and knowledge, one would dismiss it at their peril. That isn't to say you have to accept it. But there's so much in this book that will raise an eyebrow. And what I hope you will do, and I hope all of you will read the book, is read the book, consider what's in it, process it, digest it, and then make up your own mind about what you think about what Steve has to say.
Thank you.
And Steve, you mentioned the phrase, the new McCarthyism. Now, it's one thing to take a lot of heat when you say controversial matters, but I'm asking you to draw back, take a breath, and what we call on television the wide shot. Is that too strong to say there's a new McCarthyism?
Maybe. So much is generational. I remember when I came from Kentucky and Indiana, where I grew up, to Columbia to get my PhD. This was the early 60s. I was stunned by how many of my professors, who would have been then men in their probably late 50s or 60s, had been burned and chilled by McCarthy. And one of the things they said to some of us, the ones they thought might not mind their P's and Q's so much, is you got to be careful. To me, that was the legacy of McCarthy after McCarthy was gone, but the ism was still around, that in my field, people self-censored. Maybe they didn't even know it, but it was understood that if you were going to be an academic or a journalist or any person involved within the Soviet Union, be careful what you say, because it could have consequences. So today, I see in the discourse accusations that those of us who dissent from American policy. For example, I believe the Ukrainian crisis was not, as it's called in the newspapers regularly, Putin's aggression against Ukraine or an invasion, but it was triggered by the American-led attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO. And it was inevitable as any crisis imaginable when you understood what was going on. That, to me, is a kind of scholarly argument. That comes from studying what happened before. But when I made it, and not I alone, immediately came a torrent of charges that we were apologists for Putin in the Kremlin, that we were Putin's best friend, and all sorts of things like that. And lamely, the only answer I could come up with is no, I'm an apologist for American national security, and what we did in Ukraine gravely damages our national security. But the fact that you have to fight your way through these accusations makes it really hard to get traction, particularly in the mainstream. So in that sense, and maybe McCarthy isn't quite the right word, but it's that slurring of people. Now, I'll end on this note. I don't know this to be true. but I've heard it from friends I have who are still active universities, training students, that students are self-censoring. They sense out there a marketplace, and they need the marketplace. They have to raise their families, which is not receptive to people who stray too far from the mainstream consensus. That would be the worst thing that could happen, because we want our young people to think as freely as possible. That's the privilege of being young.
True.
Though I'm taking it back from myself, but nonetheless, that really worries me. And so that too is a kind of what I observed at Columbia when I came in the early 60s, how these older professors of mine were still very careful and warned us to be careful. It's that kind of thing that I call neo-McCarthyism. But I mean, again, things are generational, and I may exaggerate because of my own life experiences. I mean, you obviously feel that you don't see you were there then too. You sense something different, not the same.
Definitely.
All right.
It may be that different times demand different terms, and that neo-McCarthyism or McCarthyism isn't the right term. But from where I sit, and I think of the wise role in this context, but the nation's role has been to foster not police debate, and to not vilify those who take opposing points of view from the mainstream. So I think we're in a moment, and I won't name names, which was a bad part of the first McCarthy era, but you know, there was someone on TV the other night. Steve always wants to watch cable. One of the cable anchors said, loyal Americans don't go to Russia. A congressman who I admire from Silicon Valley, Ro Khanna, sent a letter, open letter, congressional letter, criticizing the rise of neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine, and he was vilified as Putin's puppet. So I think there's something in the bloodstream that reemerges at times of controversy. But of course, you saw your network, Dan, CBS, Edward R. Murrow played an important role in exposing the abuses and the senseless accusations of Joe McCarthy. In that context, I mean, I wanted to ask you, Dan, you were quoted in the New York Times, I think 2 Sundays ago in an interesting piece about the media and how the media abets Trump, how it is complicit in some ways. It has been in his rise, and will it play that role again in 2020? And you said too often we cover presidential elections, you've covered many of them, as spectacle. And we need history, we need perspective and context. To the extent that you followed the Russiagate story, do you feel that more history, more context, more perspective would be of value?
Well, you're kind to ask, first of all, and I do want to emphasize that I want Steve to do most of the talking here. But in direct answer to your question, that context and perspective should always be the goal of any journalist at any level. What happens particularly in today's environment, where there's a deadline every nanosecond, and a battle to get be first with something, and so you can get the first take and get all the feeds and all that, creates a new set of pressures. This is not an excuse. I don't think there are any excuses. But I don't know of any journalist practicing today anywhere near what we call the top level of journalism that hasn't made the mistake, probably many times over, of neglecting to pause, take a breath, and add context and perspective. I do think it's missing. Now, in direct answer to your question, to try to talk about current events as much as we can, that so much of the reporting, and let me pause and say, I think some of the greatest investigative reporting of my lifetime has been done on the Trump administration that's going on. Footnoting Steve's point that he thinks it's way out of context and perspective. But to answer your question, context and perspective is particularly important in covering an election campaign. All of us, and again, I include myself in it, we start out every campaign, and we're starting out this campaign, to talk about the need for context and perspective, and less about the spectacle than about the policies that are put forth. But with the pressure to meet, as I say, a deadline in a second, I'm not optimistic even about my own work. But as news consumers, I think with the public, paying attention to who at least tries to put things in context and perspective. Now, part of Steve's argument in his book is that this is really missing when it comes to the allegations against President Trump and those in his administration and the whole Watergate business. But context and perspective has to apply to almost everything. When Steve makes the, I will call it the allegation, perhaps he'd want to use the word charge, about Intelgate, that also requires some context and perspective, which is one of the things Steve tries to persuade it to provide in the book. Is, first of all, he makes the point, which a lot of people are either not aware of it or haven't paid enough attention, that he, Steve Cohen, believes, and he believes he has evidence and witness testimony to back it up, that there has been a widespread conspiracy in our intelligence operations to make the political and international narrative in one direction. Now, to give context and perspective to that, one has to listen to both sides and all sides. And part of Steve's point is, so far, in his opinion, up to now, it's been almost all one way. I don't necessarily agree with that, but there's enough in it to give me pause, and to say we should stop and question ourselves, those of us in the press.
Steve, I mean, maybe at this point, just briefly, you might explain Intelgate. I think back to history, and though we don't want to do too much history, our former Washington editor, Chris Hayes, 10 years ago, wrote a piece about the Church Committee. And for those of you who don't remember, it was the bipartisan Senate committee to investigate intelligence abuses. And the committee, to some extent, Dan, tell me if I'm wrong, was partly fueled by Cy Hirsch's reporting in the New York Times, others, and you probably covered that committee. I'm struck these days by how liberal, progressive friends valorize the intelligence community, putting aside Intelgate, which Steve will explain, because I too am skeptical about the full extent of what Steve describes. But I think skepticism is in order, and I worry that there is a kind of scrambled, upside-down Alice in Wonderland politics that's emerged, because I'd call it Trump derangement syndrome, which I can understand because he's so odious, but it shouldn't lead people to nullify their first principles. But Steve, tell us briefly how you see Intelgate, because it is at the core and it is one of the most controversial parts of your book, and it's relevant, I think, as we wait for the Mueller report, as we see what unfolds.
Well, in the book, Intelgate, I've obviously made a play on words, from Russiagate to IntelligenceGate. And I'll tell you how I came on this. You all know this so-called Steele dossier, right? You all have heard about it. This former British, if he is really former, intelligence agent who was posted in Moscow and had a big Russia profile over the years, was hired, it said, to put together negative things about Trump's relationship with Russia. So because I have some Russian expertise, I began to look into this. And the first thing I discovered, the document's about 30 or 40 pages long. There are so many mistakes in it that it doesn't seem like the mistakes that Russian intelligence would make. I mean, they had people alive who were dead and people who were in positions that they hadn't held. But anybody can make a mistake like that. But I did come to the conclusion that there was nothing in this document that suggested it had come from Russian sources, because that was Steele's claim, that he had this network who were forming. Then I asked myself another question. If Putin is really the horrible master of, bloodthirsty, ruthless master of the Kremlin he's said to be, I don't think he is, how could anybody in the Kremlin, knowing, allegedly, that Putin favored Trump in the election, allegedly, I'm actually not sure that's true either, there's a question mark. How could any ranking intelligence officials in or around the Kremlin defy Putin and abet an anti-Trump cause in America? They were putting certainly their careers and their families' well-being at risk. So then we were told by the guy who hired Steele that Steele had paid these people. So I thought, well, maybe Russians need money. But then later Simpson, the guy who hired Steele, testified to Congress that Steele hadn't been paid and none of his sources had been paid. So I was left with a document, and by the way, this is the document on which our own intelligence sources base their own so-called assessment, that this document had little validity for a working historian. And we often get documents written at a certain period, either published or in an archive. We can't just accept the document because it's a document. You or I can write a document tonight and dump it in an archive, and some historian wouldn't know we were kidding. It'll have authenticity. I couldn't find any authenticity to this Steele dossier. And then when you trace its history, the hands of John Brennan and British intelligence were all over the origins, not only of the document, of Steele himself. So I began to ask, what role did our intelligence services play in these allegations that Trump was a kind of puppet of the Kremlin? And let me end by saying that I would never make this as a flat statement. It's a question. And I think I think I titled the thing Intelgate or Russiagate with a question mark. But since nobody was asking the question, nobody had done the legwork, I thought it very important to raise the question. And all I can say is that since then, the behavior of the FBI and the CIA have become, to say the least, more and more peculiar as we learn more things about what the FBI was doing. So many people have been fired from the FBI for one reason or another. Last point about history. So Katrina, being much younger than myself, nonetheless remembers, as the keeper of the liberal progressive flame in America, there was a time, her lifetime too, when liberals and progressives were deeply suspicious of the American intelligence agencies.
Including the FBI.
Including the FBI, yeah.
So you all sitting out there remember this. Even if we think it to be true, we have to ask, how did it happen that liberals and progressives today are embracing the FBI and the CIA in their war against Trump? That's a historical question. How do we get from there to here? One explanation is the loathing for Trump. I understand that. But I don't think it's explanation enough. I mean, liberals have come a long way from wanting, the Church Committee, from wanting to expose abuses. I mean, the CIA was running assassination plots. We learned this in the church. You covered the Church Committee, right? Well, maybe you can say something about it. My memory's not that great. But we've come a very, very long way as a kind of mainstream liberal, enlightened, democratic society from having a healthy skepticism about what our intelligence services were doing to embracing them as fonts of wisdom about Trump. I mean, does loathing for Trump justify that transformation? And when Trump's gone, the intelligence services will still be here.
So let me...
Have we empowered them? Have we enabled them? I think it's a question worth asking. I don't know the answer, for sure.
Let me ask a question which speaks to your knowledge of Russia today and its configuration of power and politics. But we hear a lot about Russian oligarchs. Oleg Deripaska is in the news a lot. I think that just the other day, just last week, a Senate vote to drop sanctions on this Russian aluminum oligarch was widely seen as a gift to Deripaska and by association to Putin. Just how close are all of these Russian oligarchs like Deripaska to Putin? Because it's a constant theme, through line in the reporting.
Point.
Well, the so-called Russian oligarchs, which means, as it means in the English language, an oligarch being a person who uses political power to make money and uses money to gain political power and operate at very high levels, often not in a way beneficial to society in general. We have oligarchs. Every country has its oligarchs. But Russia created very rapidly a very nasty oligarchy in the beginning of about 8 or 9 people in the 1990s, and it's grown into an elite. The reality is you cannot be an oligarch in Russia today unless Putin says it's okay to be an oligarch in Russia today. End of story. I mean, if he wants your steel company, he can find ways to take it away from you. And there are many cases. And we know we have personal acquaintances who have lost their businesses to Putin, who gave it to another oligarch. So there were Yeltsin's oligarchs in the 90s. Now there's Putin's oligarchs. So what does it mean to be close to Putin? We know, you all know this name Deripaska. It's hard to recognize because it's hard to pronounce and read, but he's in the front page of the Times daily because allegedly Trump wanted to drop the sanctions against his company, and this shows that
it was a gift.
that he's pro-Putin or something. The reality is that the aluminum makers all over the world protested the sanctions on Deripaska's aluminum company called Rostov, I think, which I believe to be the biggest in the world, because it utterly gutted the aluminum market, made it extremely unstable. So what's this guy's name? Minchkin was getting all these complaints from European
Mnuchin.
secretaries.
Munchkin.
Whatever. Right, he was getting these complaints not from pro-Putin people, but from the big capitalists of Europe that they were doing damage to the European aluminum market. And who knew? Aluminum, or aluminium as they call it in England, turns out to be a really big business. So Deripaska, who owns this big company, was in the middle of it. So it's a problem for Putin. I mean, what is he supposed to do about this? I mean, personally, he does not like Deripaska. He's humiliated him in public on national television at least twice for things he doesn't like him. The media has this formula now. Trump's lawyer, Michael Brown.
Michael Cohen.
Cohen.
You have a block.
I have a block about all these Cohens. Cohen made a phone call in Moscow to a person who's close to the Kremlin. As a person who studied Russia all my life, I have no idea what that means, to be close to the Kremlin. The Kremlin houses what's called the presidential administration. It has 2,500 employees. Putin sits at the top. It would be hard not to be close to one of those 2,500 people if you moved in what we would call Beltway society in Moscow. So this is not a meaningful indictment or analysis to me. Trump's relations with Russia, I see them not as suspicious, but as comical. His people didn't have a clue what they were doing. And what they were trying to do was build a Trump hotel in Moscow. So I asked myself, and I'll stop on this, and I didn't vote for Trump, and I'm not going to vote for him again. I don't want impeachment. I think these things should be decided by people who voted him in, should vote him out. That's the way I prefer things. But consider this thought. For X number of years, a long time, Trump wanted to build a flagship hotel condo operation in Moscow. And he wanted to be the biggest building in Europe because that's the way he thinks. During these 13 or 14 years, virtually every international hoteler, right, Marriott, Sheraton, Ritz-Carlton, has built in Moscow. Trump was never able to build. What kind of collusion is this? Unless it's so cunning that they had a plan. Okay, we're not going to let Trump build, but instead we're going to make him our agent. Then he'll have cover, deniability, because he never built in Moscow. But Trump really exerted a lot of effort, including that beauty pageant. Remember that thing? Yep. Took to Moscow. And they were like the Keystone Cops. They didn't know phone numbers. They called public phone numbers of Putin's secretary, press secretary. Said, hi, we'd like to build a hotel in Moscow. And they said, well, why don't you call a real estate agent then? I mean, that was basically what was going on. I don't see anything sinister in it. But, you know, the Russian oligarchs are a powerful force internationally, with a lot of money. I read the other day, and I don't mean to defame the man, I'm sure he's a wonderful man, but who's the head of Starbucks?
Howard Schultz.
So he announced he may run for president, correct?
Correct.
And maybe he'd be a great president. I'm not sure which party he's going to, but I like Starbucks.
He was an independent.
Independent, yeah. All right, so
the coffee party.
My daughter, Alexandra, who's sitting in the front row, is a fan of Starbucks, and my other daughter's a fan of Starbucks, but occasionally they're drifting toward Dunkin' Donuts, I'm told. It's a whole subculture I don't know. But the guy who's the head of Starbucks sits at the head of a franchise that probably has 200 outlets in Russia. Yeah. Now, you can't do any business, coffee, hotel, or aluminum in Russia, without having an oligarch as a partner. That's a reality. So Starbucks has flourished in Russia by having oligarchical partners. I don't object to this. They're now Russia's businessmen. But if this guy runs, is this going to be raised as a question that he's had business with Russian oligarchs?
Well, it's bound to be a question in today's environment. Let me interrupt you for 1 second.
I'm done. I'm just venting, sorry.
Katrina has a long list of questions which I want to get to, but I want to cut to what for a lot of people is the chase. You've said that you didn't vote for Trump, you don't plan to vote for Trump, you don't consider yourself a Trump fan and other things. But
if he offers to make me ambassador, I might reconsider that vote.
well,
No, he won't.
I'm not a dogmatist.
I wouldn't give up your day job just
Yeah.
for it. But however,
Day job.
Steve, by any reasonable analysis, much of what you've written, including much of what you've written in this book, which I've said I hope people will read, is by any reasonable analysis is open to the interpretation that at every turn you give Putin and Trump the benefit of the doubt, but you don't give the intelligence agencies, and for that matter the press, the benefit of the doubt. But let's get right down to it. That can you explain, based on your experience in Russia and coming right up to the present hour, what strikes an overwhelming majority of Americans, even many who support President Trump, this situation in which President Trump never has said anything that was critical of Putin, and at every opportunity says something good about him. It seems, to use a Texas phrase, passing well strange, that he just consistently won't say anything critical of Putin and is hell on wheels for anybody who does. So do you have any idea why that is? Because it does lead to a lot of people saying, listen, this is not proof positive that Trump has become, whether he intended to or not, a, quote, puppet of Putin or a protege of Putin. But it certainly raises a lot of questions with a lot of people. So let's address that straightforward.
All right, so I mean, I think you raised a question that's absolutely fundamental. And here, I would say that if it's true that Trump has never criticized Putin publicly, though all this praise that he's lavished on Putin, allegedly, I've looked up, he's basically said he was a really strong leader, which I think is true. He is a really strong leader. But stop and think what Mrs. Clinton said about Putin when she was seeking the nomination. He said he was like Hitler and he had no soul. Now you tell a Russian, and Putin gets reports, that they have no soul. That's about the lowest thing you can say to a Russian. And my thought about her saying that, she just disqualified herself as a presidential candidate in my mind for this reason. Because I believe the dangers with Russia in our relationship are existential. And I want a president who can deal with the Kremlin in a way that every president since Eisenhower has, with a free hand to negotiate us away from war. To have a person who wants to be president going around saying Putin is like Hitler and has no soul, okay, she could make amends had she won. We know politicians say things they take back. But that was disqualifying for me.
But she lost. She's not president.
Yeah.
And we do have a president who has not said anything, not only has he not said anything even remotely approaching that, but as best I can figure out, he's never breathed a single syllable against Putin.
But I'm not sure what we want our presidents to say about the people who sit in the Kremlin. Let me give you an example from our lifetime. But your memory may be sharper than mine. Every president, let's leave Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who met with Stalin, but that was wartime. Right. So as Churchill said, in wartime, you make a partnership with the devil. Let's leave that aside. Every American president, I can think of no exceptions, since Eisenhower, since the 50s, met with the leader of the Kremlin because it was thought to be existential in light of nuclear weapons. That's a factual statement. Yeah. It's also more or less a factual statement that except for our crazies, the John Birch Society, we, Republicans and Democrats alike, said, please go meet and make us safer. We empowered them to do that. I don't recall any of those presidents, but there are probably exceptions, defaming the Kremlin leader in this diplomatic process, even though, and here's the paradox, they were communists, most of them with actual blood on their hands. Khrushchev, whom Eisenhower dealt with 3 times, said, I've got blood on my hands up to my elbow from the Stalin era, right? But I don't recall any American presidents who wanted to do business, diplomatic business with the Kremlin, defaming the leader. I call that diplomacy. And I was not used to, personally, an American would-be president, though Rubio did it all the time too, calling the leader of the Kremlin with whom that person would have to deal conceivably in a Cuban Missile Crisis-like situation, defaming them publicly. I just thought that she was the anomaly, not Trump. And if I was advising Trump, and he said, what am I supposed to say to all these people who say I never say anything nasty about Putin? I say, well, I wouldn't want him to marry into the family and then just go on. I mean, but I don't see making a cause out of this because I see it as diplomatic and a diplomacy we might well need. I'll end on this. We're eyeball to eyeball with the Russians in Ukraine, in Syria, and in Georgia. That's 3 times the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's easy to imagine a direct conflict. We are going to have to ask Trump to save us whether we like him or not. Is it going to help for him going around saying Putin's a butcher and he kills people and he's like Hitler? Where's our security in that? So maybe I'm overly obsessed by the dangerous relationship between the United States and Russia and prepared to give Trump a pass on this one. Maybe that's my problem.
I do think Trump has an affinity for, it's like springtime for strongmen with Trump. I mean, he is, he doesn't say bad things about Duterte, occasionally Erdogan, but he does seem to favor those kinds of leaders. But I do think, putting aside the personalities, many of you may know that the national defense strategy of the United States is no longer to privilege or lead with the global war against terror, but to make China and Russia our adversaries. They are the existential threats to America, according to this national defense strategy. So I wanted to ask Steve, the threat of Russia invading its neighbors is treated as a real possibility in the US media almost every day. Subject of constant speculation, recent headlines. How real do you think this possibility is? Is there a real threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine's been a catastrophe for Putin, politically and internationally. So the last thing he wants is an escalation of these proxy wars going on. On the other hand, and people here might object to this, particularly any of you with ties to Ukraine, the regime in Kiev is a provocation regime. It's looking to provoke a war with Russia because it thinks that NATO and America are going to take it in embrace. Look at the stunt. Do you all remember November 25th? It happened to be my birthday when it happened, and I think we just arrived in Moscow.
That's right, November 25th.
When there's a shootout between Ukrainian and Russian gunboats in the Sea of Azov off the Black Sea. Remember that?
Yes.
Yes.
I looked at it on video 20 times. I read all the press accounts. 100% Ukraine provoked that. The rules for passing through that narrow strait are centuries old. You have to take on a Russian pilot to go through the straits. You have to inform the Russians, I don't remember whether it's 1 day or 2 days in advance that you're coming. The Ukrainians didn't do any of this. They were looking to provoke an episode, and they got it. And now it's become an example of Putin's aggression. How is it aggression? What's aggression? If a car comes across the George Washington Bridge in a lane going the wrong way, that person's going to be stopped. Who's the aggressor here? So I worry about provocations. We know from Cy Hirsch, or we think we know from Cy Hirsch, that some of the gas attacks blamed on Assad may not have been the case. I don't know, I don't have the scientific knowledge, but Professor Theodore Postel, who writes for The Nation occasionally, seems to support this. We're living in an exceedingly dangerous world with short fuses where a lot of people out there would like to light the fuse. So it's not just Russia and the United States who could get us into trouble. There are a lot of people with agendas that are not in anybody's interest except their own. So a provocation, would Russia send more troops across the border into Donbass? It's possible. Crimea is settled. Crimea was historically Russian. Administratively, accidentally, it was Ukrainian. It is now Russian. And in our lifetime, it will always be Russian territory. On the other hand, with goodwill, there's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't have equal access to Crimea. But, politics prevent that now.
So I want to echo something Dan said about you are a professor, you know your history. So I think one of the great values of this book is you bring to bear history, so that, you know, every night we get the breaking news. There's always breaking news, but you bring history to bear. So a question from the audience. It's been reported that Trump doesn't allow notes, records of his meetings with Putin. What's up with that?
Good question.
So the person we should ask, do you all know the name Jack Matlock? No. He was ambassador to the Soviet Union. You know him personally, you know Jack. Jack is now working away down in Durham, North Carolina, or on his farm in Tennessee, but he's very engaged. Jack posted a few things on his Facebook that says that this allegation that Trump didn't follow procedure with Putin isn't correct. That in his own personal experience, he knows of many meetings, or at least enough meetings, where presidents have met only with their translators. So here's one in our lifetime, though, to amend that, and I will in a second, which you and I remember. Well, many of you remember. Trump and Reagan, Gorbachev and Reagan met in Finland.
In
Reykjavik.
Iceland.
In Iceland. I've mangled the whole story.
Sorry, go ahead.
But met in Reykjavik, Iceland in October 1986.
Right.
Reagan by then was aging. And his age didn't want him to meet alone with Gorbachev, who was like 55 and bouncing around, right? You remember that.
I do.
Yeah. Even you looked at me and said, "Guy, he seems kind of young for a Soviet leader. What's going on, Steve? Does that matter?" And we had a discussion. Did it matter that he was younger? You remember all that, right? But Reagan's aides were worried because Reagan was, and we know he later had problems. They were worried about him alone with Gorbachev, but they went in there with their translators. And they came out, and they said to all their aides that were waiting, "We've decided to abolish all nuclear weapons."
Right.
And the aides go, "I told you not to let him go in there alone with Gorbachev." But it turned out, something interesting, that both men had a deep loathing and hatred of nuclear weapons for different biographical reasons. That's why Reagan came up with this idea of a shield that would protect us.
Star Wars.
Star Wars. So they said, you can't do that. Let's have another meeting with aides. But what did they do 1 year later? 1 year later, for the first time in history, Reagan and Gorbachev abolished an entire category of nuclear weapons, the so-called intermediate range ones, which you remember because you were covering the story, that the Europeans were very worried about because they flew under radar, they flew fast. Russia was on the European continent with its intermediate range ones. We had ours, the SS something or other, in Europe. That was the first act ever, and remains so today, of nuclear abolitionism. And it occurred partly because these two guys met alone, without their aides saying, no, 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 you can't do that. So there are different cases. Jack Matlock himself, then he says, for the next meeting, where they were going to fine-tune this idea, was asked to be a note-taker. But there was no Russian note-taker. So, and here's another case that's stunning. I get this from Jack Matlock, but it's in the history books. Nixon, when he met with Brezhnev, and Nixon was very suspicious of the American intelligence services, which were against Nixon's détente, did not use an American translator at all. Stop and think what I'm saying.
They used a Russian.
Nixon used Brezhnev's translator. And now we talk about why do we need history? Because what Michael Flynn did, General Flynn did, who he may still go to prison for it because he lied about it. And he's been ruined. I don't like Flynn. I don't like his views. I don't like anything about him. But when he called the Russian ambassador after Trump was elected and said, don't do anything radical about these new sanctions that Obama has leveled on you, we will sort that out when we take office, is exactly what almost every American president-elect, not president, president-elect, has had his national security guy do. Make a call to the Russians and tell them to chill until we take office. Matlock did it for Reagan. Michael McFaul did it for Obama. This is a tradition. So what Flynn did was normal, was necessary. Now, why lie to the FBI about it? Maybe because he felt that his loyalty was to his president. And not, I don't know why he lied about it. But what he did was right and normal and customary and something we should want. So this is where history is really important, to know the prehistory of these episodes. They become less scandalous when you know the history.
So two or three more questions, but just a reminder, copies of War with Russia, ? Available for sale. We'll be signing afterwards. This question goes, I think, to the nature, how people view both Putin, Russia, the politics, what we hear about the killings of journalists, of control of the political landscape. But does anything go on in Russia without Putin knowing about it?
Well, I mean, we always thought that since Stalin was probably among the certainly among the very, very worst despots of 20th century history, and his terror swept away millions of people, mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, that nothing in Russia under Stalin could possibly take place without his all-pervasive police knowing it. But it turns out that people continue to have sex in various ways and have private thoughts and even write private thoughts down and hide them away. And somehow, under the repression, carry on with their lives. And when Stalin died, it all popped out. Lots of kids, lots of literature, lots of movies that had all been stuffed in the drawer, right? So I give you an exaggerated reply to that. How would we characterize Putin's political system today? Most political scientists, and I no longer consider myself a political scientist, but the literature on Russia among professional American political scientists has a consensus, and that is the Putin regime or system is a soft authoritarian one. That's the expression that political science means. Now, what does that mean? You ask these people, what's a soft authoritarian? There's no terror. Censorship barely exists. The best American correspondent working in Russia today, in my opinion, and maybe really the only good one, really first rate, is Fred Weir of the Christian Science Monitor. And I happen to notice that Fred wrote today, though Fred is no fan of Putin, that Russia is probably more prosperous and freer, Russians, than they have ever been in their history today. Wow. Now, you know, that's like saying Dan and I are short people compared to a 7-foot center of the Knicks, maybe. I mean, what kind of generalization is that? But I think it's probably true. But it's not due to Putin. This was created first by Gorbachev, then during the Yeltsin years, after the Soviet Union. But Putin has abetted it. He hasn't shut it down. And we ought to care, just for humanitarian reasons, that Russians, ordinary people, not privileged people, not oligarchs, but folks, are probably better off today than they have ever been in Russian history. That doesn't mean it's really great and we want to exchange lives with them. But we all live within our own skin. We live within our own lives, our own societies. And if you look at Russia in terms of where Russia's been, not clear where it's going, but where it's been, most Russians feel themselves better off than their parents and grandparents were. And that is why, no matter how mad people are at Putin today about raising the pension age, he still has a bedrock 60% support in the country. It's not 80 anymore. No. Pensions wipe that out. But, I mean, that really tells you something, like him or not. And it should count for something. But that maybe is just my special empathy because I spent so many years interacting with Russia.
Did you? No. I was going to ask both of you if I could. Russiagate, whatever that means, it means different things. It means the view that Russia meddled in our election, or it could mean Kremlin put Trump in the White House, but Russiagate's going to eventually end in some way. I mean, we're all waiting for Mueller's report. We're waiting to learn more about what we don't know. So it's going to have a legacy. A question to both of you, what do you think its legacy will be? I mean, after Trump, after Putin, they're not immortal. Can we envision and imagine what it means for the future of our politics? The legitimacy of our elections has been questioned. Our democracy. So I just ask you to think beyond this moment, but in the context of what we read and hear about every day, the Russiagate story.
Well, I'd be most interested in Professor Cohen's judgment on that. But I would say this, that, and I've tried to remind myself of it because it's very hard to do, particularly in the hyper-energetic news environment,
Right.
which, among other things. But this is time for us to be very steady and very patient. Plus, minus are hard to tell. Mueller knows a hell of a lot more than anybody, including myself, who's been talking about it on cable television or writing about it. And I consider it to be a fact. I think Steve has a different view. That the Russians, now that's a broad general phrase, but the Russians made an effort to muck around in our election campaign. What we don't know, and we can't know until at least Mueller comes out with his report and his report is made public, which is by no means certain, which is a whole other subject for another time. We don't know whether A, anybody anywhere near to the top of the Trump campaign was actively involved in that in any way. And the most important thing is we don't know whether Trump himself was. I don't like the word collusion. I think it's too vague a word. The question is, was there or was there not a conspiracy that included high-ranking members of the Trump campaign and the early stages of his administration and or the president himself? Were they directly involved in the conspiracy? Now, there's a lot of circumstantial indications and a lot of hypotheticals about connecting the so-called dots of that. But I just come back to, hard as it is, we need to be steady, we need to be patient, and wait until Mueller's report comes out, and hope and pray that it's public. Because short of that, all of this speculation, including some of my own, all of this wonder and worry about what happened and what didn't happen, is destructive to our democratic process because it undercuts the public's confidence in the integrity of our election system. Now, I'm setting aside there's a whole argument, well, that was the Russians, that was Putin, I'll put that in quotation marks, aim. But already there's damage been done to the public's belief that insofar as it's humanly possible to make it so, our elections have integrity. And that much of that damage has already been done. We can spend the rest of the night talking about whether the press has the biggest responsibility or the intelligence community, whatever. But much of the damage has already been done. And as often the case with severe damage, it can't be repaired immediately. So looking forward, however this turns out, whatever the results of the Mueller investigation and the final history's judgment on Trump, I think we're going to be dealing with the consequences of this period for a very long time.
I was just going to say, I mean, we came out of the midterms in an interesting way, it seemed to me, Dan, where, which doesn't mean that the Mueller investigation isn't important and should not be protected, but Russiagate didn't play a role in the midterms. I mean, it wasn't on people's minds.
No.
And Gallup even had a poll showing 57% of Americans wanted better relations with Russia, and that voter suppression was something that more voters worried about in terms of the legitimacy, integrity. So I hope
gerrymandering.
I hope that what comes out of this moment might be a real project, which should have happened after the selection of the president in 2000, an integrity election project. But Steve, I'm sorry. What is your thinking?
Well, Steve bats cleanup on this, as he.
Yeah, he does.
I'm at cleanup?
I think you have the last before we go to signing.
I don't know why Dan, knowing that I'm from Kentucky, never mentions my jump shot. And it seems to be...
I didn't know you had one.
Had one. Look, I have a lot of problems because of where I come from dealing with all this. And I always fall back on history. And maybe this doesn't matter. But Dan says we know that Russia mucked around in our elections. We do. We do know that. And like the good captain in Casablanca, I'm shocked. Because the two countries have mucked around in each other's elections ever since Woodrow Wilson sent American troops to intervene in the Russian Civil War in 1918.
Before.
Or, to give a more modern example, the Clinton administration went beyond all decency in helping Boris Yeltsin, get reelected in 1996. I mean, beyond any decency, including a $10 billion IMF loan so Yeltsin could finally pay pensions and salaries, sending professional American political operators to encamp in the presidential hotel and run the campaign. And we were so proud of that Showtime made a movie about it called Spinning or Saving Boris, I think. And Time magazine, when Yeltsin won, ran a cover with Yeltsin dressed up as Yankee Doodle Dandy, wrapped in an American flag, with a banner reading, "Yanks to the rescue." We were very pleased that we got Yeltsin or helped get him reelected. So we are surprised that Russians are mucking around in our elections.
Excuse me, I didn't say we were surprised. Right. I'm saying we should be concerned about it.
Okay, so that then brings me, now the historian's gone. I've just contexted, fair enough. What I do not know, and what I too would worry about, is what the degree of this and nature of this was in 2016. Was it really not run-of-the-mill, something quite different? Leaving open the question of the role of social media, but I've never understood that if the Russians were so clever in figuring out where to direct their social media, why Clinton's boy geniuses couldn't figure this out too and get her elected. I mean, what makes the Russians clever about American social, I mean, I just couldn't figure this out. But I will accept the question. Did something happen that really now is not in the historical pattern, even taking into account what Clinton did for Yeltsin because he did it publicly. I mean, that was not surreptitious. We were encamped. It was public. And all I say in the book is, and it's not all I say because in this environment it's a lot, is I have looked and looked and looked and I can find no evidence of anything larger and more suspicious. Well, wait, but, I may not be looking in the right places. And it may be that my evaluation, that purported evidence that appears almost every day in the New York Times, I don't find it persuasive. Maybe I've even developed a bias, and a stake in my own argument. I don't rule that out. But I would say, and this is my final word tonight, and this is why I really am worried. If we prevent Trump from doing diplomacy with Russia, that we say he can't do it because he's an agent of Russia. And even though we see crises and potential Cuban Missile-like crises around the world today, and we say we're not going to let Trump do it, in such a crisis, who's going to do it? Congress going to do it? The New York Times going to do it? There's nobody to do it. And if nobody does it, it means war with Russia. And we don't want to test the theory that war with Russia could easily slide into nuclear war. We don't want to test that at all. We don't want to get anywhere near that line. And that's why I think this Russiagate, and I call it in the book such, has become the #1 threat to American national security. The #1 threat. We can hate on Trump all we want, but until we vote him out, we have to entrust him to keep us safe if a crisis like this occurs. That's my bottom line. Now, maybe it's alarmist, maybe it's extremist, maybe it comes from too much Russia on my brain. Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe not. And we don't want to find out.
So I want to thank Dan, and I want to thank Steve for this most civil of discussions. It is rare in terms of Russia to have such civil discussions.
Unprecedented.